My husband Dean thought he was so clever, planning his own fake death to collect $3 million in life insurance and disappear with his secretary. But what he didn't know was that I had already discovered his scheme and made some changes of my own. When he finally died in that boating accident and tried to cash in on my grief, he got a very different kind of surprise than the tropical paradise he was expecting, one that involved handcuffs, federal agents, and a debt that would follow him for the rest of his very real life. But let me start from the beginning, because the story of how I turned my husband's perfect crime into his perfect nightmare is one that took months to unfold. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. And every detail matters. My name is Jessica, and for 8 years, I thought I was living the American dream. Picture this: a beautiful colonial house in Westfield, New Jersey, with white picket fences and rose bushes that bloomed every spring. 2 cars in the driveway, his BMW and my Honda CR-V. A golden retriever named Max who greeted us at the door, every evening with the kind of unconditional love that made everything else seem perfect. Dean Matthews was everything I thought I wanted in a husband when we met at a charity gala in Manhattan 9 years ago. He was tall, confident, with the kind of smile that could light up a room and make you forget your own name. He worked in commercial real estate development, always talking about his next big deal, always dressed in expensive suits that made him look like he'd stepped out of a magazine. I was working as a marketing coordinator for a nonprofit organization. Back then, making decent money but nothing extravagant. Dean swept me off my feet with weekend trips to the Hamptons, dinners at restaurants I couldn't pronounce the names of, and a proposal on a beach in Santorini that felt like something out of a movie. When he slipped that 2-carat diamond ring on my finger, I genuinely believed I was the luckiest woman alive. Our wedding was everything I'd dreamed of: a ceremony at the Ritz-Carlton overlooking the Hudson River, 300 guests, and a reception that probably cost more than most people's annual salary. Dean insisted on the best of everything. "Nothing's too good for my wife," he'd say, and I believed him. I believed every word that came out of his mouth. For the first few years, our life together was exactly what it looked like from the outside. Dean's business was thriving. We bought the house in Westfield, furnished it with antiques and art pieces that Dean claimed were investments. We took vacations to Europe, the Caribbean, anywhere Dean wanted to go. I left my nonprofit job to start my own boutique marketing consultancy, working with small businesses and local organizations. It wasn't as glamorous as Dean's world, but I loved what I did, and it gave me the flexibility to be the wife he seemed to want. But here's the thing about perfect lives: they're usually too good to be true. The cracks started showing about 2 years ago, though I didn't recognize them as cracks at the time. Dean became more secretive about his work, spending longer hours at the office, taking calls in the other room. When I'd ask about his day, he'd give me vague answers about difficult clients and complex negotiations. He started traveling more frequently, sometimes for days at a time, to cities I'd never heard him mention before. I told myself it was just the nature of his business. Real estate development is complicated, I reasoned. Big deals require discretion. Successful men have demanding schedules. I was being a supportive wife by not prying, by trusting him to handle his professional life while I handled ours. What I didn't know then was that Dean's business hadn't been thriving for years. What I didn't know was that the expensive lifestyle we were living was built on a foundation of lies, debt, and increasingly desperate schemes. What I didn't know was that while I was playing the perfect wife, Dean was planning the perfect exit strategy, one that would leave me widowed, wealthy, and completely unaware that my husband was sipping cocktails on a beach somewhere with his secretary Angeline. The irony is that if Dean had just been honest with me about his financial problems, I would have helped him. I would have downsized our lifestyle, sold the house, done whatever it took to support the man I loved. But Dean didn't want a partner in solving his problems. He wanted a victim to pay for them. And that's exactly what he thought I was going to be. See, there's something about me that Dean never fully understood, something that would ultimately be his downfall. I'm not just the sweet, trusting wife he married. I'm also the daughter of Detective Lieutenant Albert Morrison of the Newark Police Department. Now, my father and I haven't spoken in 5 years. We had a falling out over my marriage, actually. He never liked Dean, said something about him didn't sit right. I was so in love, so convinced that my father was just being overprotective, that I chose Dean over family dinners and holiday gatherings. But you don't grow up as a cop's daughter without learning a few things about human nature, about the importance of evidence, and about how people reveal their true selves when they think no one is watching. My father might not have been in my life anymore, but his lessons were still in my head. Which is why, when Dean's behavior started changing, when the late-night phone calls and mysterious business trips began piling up, I didn't just ignore my instincts. I started paying attention. I started watching. I started remembering every detail, every inconsistency, every moment when Dean's story didn't quite add up. I didn't know I was gathering evidence for the case of my life. I thought I was just being a concerned wife trying to understand why her husband was pulling away. But as it turned out, those months of careful observation, of noting every strange phone call and unexplained absence, would become the foundation of Dean's downfall. Because while Dean was busy planning what he thought would be the perfect crime, I was unknowingly building the perfect case against him. And when the time came for his grand finale, when he thought he was finally going to cash in on years of deception and manipulation, he discovered that his sweet, naive wife had learned a few tricks of her own. The man who thought he could outsmart. Everyone had forgotten the most important rule of any con: never underestimate your mark. Especially when your mark happens to be someone who inherited more than just her father's eyes. To understand how completely Dean fooled me, you need to understand what our life looked like from the inside. Every morning started the same way. Dean's alarm at 6:30 a.m., followed by his ritualistic routine of checking his phone, showering, and selecting one of his perfectly pressed suits from our walk-in closet. I'd make coffee in our granite-countered kitchen while he reviewed what he called his deal sheets, documents that always seemed important but that he never let me look at too closely. "Big day today, babe," he'd say, kissing my forehead before grabbing his leather briefcase. "The Riverside project is finally moving forward. If this closes, we're looking at a 7-figure commission." I'd smile and wish him luck, proud that my husband was so successful, so driven. The Riverside project had been almost closing for about 6 months, but I figured that's just how big deals worked. Lots of moving parts, lots of waiting. Our evenings were equally predictable and comfortable. Dean would come home around 7, usually with stories about difficult investors or permit delays. We'd have dinner together, sometimes takeout from our favorite Italian place, sometimes something I'd cook while working from my home office. He'd ask about my day, my clients, and I'd tell him about the small businesses I was helping with their marketing strategies. He always seemed genuinely interested, supportive of my work even though it was clearly small scale compared to his. Multi-million-dollar developments. Weekends were our time. Saturday mornings meant sleeping in, then walking Max through the neighborhood where Dean would point out houses and critique their architectural choices. "See that addition? Completely destroys the flow of the original structure. When we renovate, we'll do it right." We talked about renovating our own house constantly, adding a pool, finishing the basement, maybe even buying the lot next door to expand our garden. Dean always had grand plans for our future. Saturday evenings were for socializing. Dean loved entertaining, and our house became the regular gathering spot for his business associates and their wives. I'd spend hours preparing appetizers and arranging flowers while Dean set up his sound system and stocked the bar. These parties were where Dean truly shone. He was the perfect host, charming and confident, telling stories about his latest deals and making everyone feel important. I loved watching him work the room, the way he'd remember details about people's children, or ask follow-up questions about conversations from months ago. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. "Dean, you should run for mayor," his friend Jensen would always joke. "You've got the politician thing down perfectly." "Maybe someday," Dean would laugh. "But first, I've got to finish making my fortune in real estate." Sundays were quieter. We'd read the newspaper over breakfast, Dean focusing on the business section while I caught up on local news. Sometimes we'd drive to nearby towns to look at properties Dean claimed he was considering for future projects. He'd walk through these houses with the confidence of someone who knew exactly what he was looking at, pointing out structural issues or praising original hardwood floors. "This place has good bones," he'd say, knocking on walls and examining. "Crown molding. Location's perfect too. In 5 years, this neighborhood's going to be the next hot area." I believed every word. Why wouldn't I? Dean seemed to know everything about everything: architecture, finance, local zoning laws, market trends. When we'd drive past construction sites, he'd explain what they were building and why it would or wouldn't succeed. His confidence was infectious. Our financial life seemed equally solid. We had joint checking and savings accounts, though Dean handled most of the big-picture financial planning. "I live and breathe this stuff all day," he'd say when I'd offer to help with investments or major purchases. "Let me handle the boring money stuff so you can focus on growing your business." Every month, Dean would show me statements proving our investments were performing well, our retirement accounts growing steadily. He'd explain market fluctuations and why certain stocks were good long-term holds. "We're building something here, Jess," he'd say, pulling me close as we reviewed our portfolio. "By the time we're 50, we'll be set for life." He was generous with gifts: jewelry for our anniversary, a surprise weekend in Boston for my birthday, a new laptop when mine started running slowly. "Success means nothing if I can't spoil my wife," he'd say whenever I protested that something was too expensive. The life insurance policies came up during one of these financial planning sessions, about 18 months ago. Dean had spreadsheets printed out, charts showing our assets and liabilities, projected retirement scenarios. "There's one gap in our planning," he said, pointing to a section highlighted in yellow. "If something happened to one of us, the other would struggle to maintain our lifestyle. We need life insurance." It made perfect sense. We had the house, car payments, a certain standard of living. If Dean died, I'd lose his income. If I died, he'd lose my contribution to our household, plus he'd probably want to hire help for things I usually handled. "How much are we talking about?" I asked, scanning his calculations. $3 million each should cover it. Sounds like a lot, but when you factor in mortgage payments, maintaining the house, potential medical expenses as we age, it's really just responsible planning. $3 million. The number seemed huge, but Dean's logic was sound. We were young, healthy, the premiums wouldn't be terrible. And it was exactly the kind of forward-thinking financial planning that separated successful couples from those who lived paycheck to paycheck. "You really think we need that much?" I asked. Dean pulled up insurance calculators on his laptop, showing me formulas for replacement income and future expenses. "Trust me, babe. I've seen what happens to families who don't plan properly. We're not going to be those people." So we applied for the policies. Dean handled most of the paperwork, since he understood insurance better than I did. We had medical exams, answered questions about our health and lifestyle, provided financial documentation. The whole process took about 6 weeks, but eventually we were approved. "There," Dean said when the final documents arrived. "Now we're completely protected, no matter what life throws at us." I felt secure, loved, and grateful to have a husband who planned so carefully for our future. Little did I know that while I was feeling protected, Dean was actually setting up the most elaborate trap of my life. The first crack in our perfect facade appeared on a Tuesday morning in October, about 6 months after we'd finalized the life. Insurance policies. I was in my home office, working on a social media campaign for a local bakery, when I heard Dean's phone buzzing incessantly from the kitchen counter. He was in the shower, and the sound was driving me crazy. I walked over to silence it, not intending to snoop, but the name on the screen caught my attention. A. Sterling. The phone had been buzzing for 5 minutes straight, clearly someone who needed to reach Dean urgently. When it finally stopped, I saw 17 missed calls from the same number. When Dean's face went pale for just a split second before he forced a smile. "Oh, that's Albert Sterling, one of my investors. Guy's a bit neurotic, probably just wants an update on something." He grabbed his phone and headed toward the garage. I'll call him back from the car. But through the kitchen window, I watched Dean pace back and forth in our driveway for 20 minutes, his free hand gesturing frantically as he spoke. This didn't look like a casual investor update. This looked like damage control. That afternoon, curiosity got the better of me. I Googled Albert Sterling Real Estate New Jersey. Nothing. No development company, no investment firm, no business profiles. Strange, considering Dean always talked about how important his investor relationships were, how these people were major players in New Jersey real estate. When Dean came home that evening, I asked about Albert Sterling again, just to see his reaction. "Oh, you know these investor types," Dean said, not quite meeting my eyes. "Very private, very low profile. They don't want their names splashed all over the internet." It was a reasonable explanation, but something about Dean's body language bothered me. He was fidgeting with his wedding ring, a nervous habit I'd noticed but never really thought about before. The second warning sign came 2 weeks later. I was cleaning out Dean's car, something I occasionally did as a nice gesture, when I found a receipt tucked in the glove compartment. Morton's Steakhouse in Manhattan, $247 for dinner for two. The date was from the previous Thursday when Dean had told me he was working late on permit applications. I stared at that receipt for a long time. Dean hated Morton's. He'd always said their steaks were overpriced and overrated. We'd been there once for a business dinner with his colleagues, and he'd complained about it for weeks afterward. So why was he eating there, and why with someone else? When I asked him about it that evening, Dean had another perfectly reasonable explanation. "Oh, that. Yeah, I had to take Albert Sterling's wife to dinner. Part of keeping the investors happy, you know? She was in town for the day, and Albert asked me to show her around. Boring as hell, but you do what you have to do." Again, reasonable. But Dean was fidgeting with his ring again, and he'd avoided using her name. Albert Sterling's wife. Not Mrs. Sterling or Patricia or whatever her actual name was. Just Albert Sterling's wife. The third incident happened in November. Dean had left his laptop open on the kitchen table while he took a phone call outside. I wasn't trying to spy. I was just walking past when I noticed his email was open, and the subject line of the top message caught my eye. Confirmation, Paradise Cove Resort, Turks and Caicos. My heart skipped. Dean hadn't mentioned anything about a trip to Turks and Caicos. We'd talked about maybe going somewhere warm for Christmas, but we hadn't made any concrete plans. I leaned closer, trying to read the details without actually touching his computer. The booking was for December 15th through January 2nd, almost 3 weeks. 2 guests, oceanfront suite. The name on the reservation was Dean Matthews, but the email address wasn't his usual business account. It was email protected. An email address I'd never seen before. When Dean came back inside, I decided to test him. "Hey, have you thought any more about Christmas vacation? Maybe somewhere warm?" "Actually, yeah," Dean said, closing his laptop quickly. "I was thinking we could do something tropical. Maybe Turks and Caicos? I heard Paradise Cove Resort is supposed to be amazing." "Sounds expensive," I said, watching his face carefully. "Well, the Riverside deal should close before Christmas. We can afford to splurge a little." The Riverside deal. Always the Riverside deal. I was starting to wonder if this mythical project actually existed. But what really bothered me wasn't the resort reservation. It was the timeline. December 15th through January 2nd. Dean had never taken 3 weeks off work in all the years I'd known him. He was always talking about how real estate was a 24/7 business, how deals could fall apart if you weren't constantly managing them. The fourth warning sign was the most obvious, though I almost missed it entirely. I was at the grocery store in early December when I ran into Jenna Blackwood, the wife of one of Dean's supposed business associates. We'd met at several of Dean's networking events, and she'd always been friendly. "Jessica, how are you? I feel like we haven't seen you and Dean at any events lately." I was confused. "What do you mean? Dean's been super busy with the Riverside project, but we were just at the Thompsons' party last month." Jenna looked puzzled. "The Thompsons' party? Jessica, my husband and I were at that party. You guys definitely weren't there." My stomach dropped. "Are you sure?" Dean said. "Positive. Actually, now that I think about it, we haven't seen Dean at any industry events in months. Marcus was just saying the other day that Dean seems to have dropped off the radar entirely." I laughed it off, made some excuse about mixed up dates and busy schedules. But inside, I was reeling. Dean had definitely told me about going to the Thompsons' party. He'd come home with stories about the conversations he'd had, the business cards he'd collected. I remembered because he'd been particularly excited about a potential new client he'd met. That night, I did something I'd never done before in our entire marriage. I went through Dean's suit pockets while he was sleeping. I found business cards, but when I looked them up online, half of the companies didn't exist. The other half were legitimate businesses, but when I checked their websites, none of them listed Dean as an employee or associate. I found restaurant receipts from places Dean had never mentioned going to, all for meals for two. I found a parking stub from Newark Airport dated 3 days ago, a day when Dean had supposedly been in meetings all day in Princeton. But the most damning thing I found was a handwritten note in Dean's own writing. "A Tice confirm boat, deck 16. Weather window deck 1820. Money transfer complete by deck 22. I stared at that note until my eyes burned. A boat, money transfer, and that initial, A, the same A from A. Sterling. The same A from that mysterious email address, email protected. Suddenly, Albert Sterling wasn't sounding like an investor anymore. Suddenly, that name was starting to sound a lot more like Angeline. I put everything back exactly where I'd found it and lay in bed next to my sleeping husband, my mind racing. Either Dean was having an affair or he was involved in something much worse than an affair. The fake business cards, the non-existent meetings, the mysterious phone calls, the secret email account. This wasn't just about another woman. This was about deception on a scale I couldn't even comprehend yet. But I was about to find out exactly how deep Dean's lies went and just how much danger I was actually in. After finding that handwritten note, I couldn't sleep. I lay there next to Dean, listening to his steady breathing, studying his face in the dim light from our alarm clock. This man who I'd shared a bed with for 8 years suddenly felt like a stranger. Every peaceful expression, every familiar feature looked different when viewed through the lens of deception. I started paying attention to everything in a way I never had before. When Dean's phone rang, I memorized the names. When he left for meetings, I noted the time and what he was wearing. When he came home with stories about his day, I listened for inconsistencies. It didn't take long to find them. The next morning, Dean announced he had a crucial meeting with the City Planning Commission about the Riverside project. "Could be the breakthrough we've been waiting for," he said, straightening his burgundy tie. "If this goes well, we could be looking at groundbreaking by spring." After he left, I did something that would have seemed paranoid just a week earlier. I called the Princeton City Planning Commission and asked about their meeting schedule. "I'm sorry, ma'am, but we don't have any meetings scheduled today," the receptionist told me. "Our next session isn't until the 15th. My hands were shaking as I hung up the phone. Dean had lied. Directly, specifically, unnecessarily lied. Not about something small or social, but about his work, the foundation of our entire life together. I decided to follow him. I'd never done anything like this before, but desperation makes you capable of things you never imagined. I waited 15 minutes, then got in my Honda and drove toward downtown Princeton, the route Dean always took to his office meetings. I had no real plan, just a desperate need to know where my husband was actually going. I spotted his BMW in the parking lot of a Marriott hotel about 20 minutes from our house. My heart started pounding as I parked across the street, trying to figure out what to do next. Was Dean meeting someone here? Having an affair? Something worse? I didn't have to wait long for my answer. Through the hotel's glass lobby doors, I could see Dean sitting at the bar with a woman. Even from a distance, I could tell she was young, blonde, and beautiful. She was wearing a professional-looking dress, but the way she was leaning into Dean, the way her hand rested on his arm, this wasn't a business meeting. I sat in my car for 2 hours, watching them. They ordered drinks, then lunch. They talked, animatedly, Dean using the same hand gestures he used when he was excited about something. The woman laughed at his stories, touched his face affectionately. When they finally got up to leave, Dean put his hand on the small of her back and guided her toward the elevators. They were going upstairs, to a room, together. I drove home in a daze, my entire world crumbling around me. Dean was having an affair. All those late meetings, mysterious phone calls, secret email accounts. It was all about another woman. The life insurance policies, the vacation bookings, the lies about where he was going. Everything suddenly made a different kind of sense. But it was the kind of sense that made me feel sick. When Dean came home that evening, he was in an unusually good mood. "Great news, babe," he said, kissing my cheek. The planning commission meeting went even better than expected. We're moving forward with Phase 1 of Riverside. I stared at him, this man who could lie so effortlessly to the person who loved him most in the world. "That's wonderful," I managed. "Tell me about it." And Dean did. For 20 minutes, he spun an elaborate story about zoning approvals and permit processes, about commissioners who asked tough questions, and architects who presented brilliant solutions. Every word was fiction, delivered with the confidence of someone who had no idea his wife had spent the afternoon watching him cheat. I excused myself to the bathroom and threw up. Over the next few days, I started noticing things I'd somehow missed before. Dean's clothes occasionally smelled like perfume. Not my perfume, something floral and expensive. His credit card statements, which I rarely looked at closely, showed charges at restaurants and hotels I'd never been to. His phone, which used to sit casually on our kitchen counter, was now always face down and always within his reach. The worst part was how normal he acted at home. Dean was still affectionate, still interested in my work, still making plans for our future. He'd talk about renovating the kitchen or maybe taking a cruise for our anniversary, all while maintaining whatever relationship he had with the blonde woman from the hotel. I started having imaginary conversations with him in my head, practicing how I'd confront him about the affair. But every time I worked up the courage to actually say something, I'd lose my nerve. What if I was wrong? What if there was some explanation I hadn't considered? The confrontation finally happened by accident. Dean's phone rang while he was in the shower, and without thinking, I answered it. "Dean?" a woman's voice said. "It's Angeline. Did you talk to Jensen about the boat? We need to make sure everything's ready for next week." My blood turned to ice. Angeline, the mysterious A from all those clues I'd been collecting. And she was talking about a boat, just like the note I'd found in Dean's pocket. "I'm sorry," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "Dean's not available. Right now. Can I take a message?" There was a long pause. Who is this? This is his wife. The silence that followed was deafening. Then quietly, "Oh, I'll call back later." She hung up. When Dean came downstairs, I was holding his phone. "Angeline called," I said simply. Dean's face went through a series of expressions: surprise, panic, calculation, before settling on forced casualness. "Angeline? Oh, she's Albert Sterling's assistant, probably calling about the investment timeline. She asked about a boat, Dean." "A boat?" Dean laughed, but it sounded hollow. "Must be some kind of miscommunication. Maybe she meant a loan and it got garbled. You know how cell phone connections can be." I stared at him. "She knew I was your wife, Dean. She seemed very surprised to hear from me?" Well, of course she was surprised. She was expecting to reach me, not you. "Look, Jess, I think you might be reading too much into... Are you having an affair?" The question hung in the air between us like a physical thing. Dean's eyes widened, and for a moment, I thought he might actually tell me the truth. Instead, he did something worse. He looked hurt. "Jessica, how could you even ask me that? After everything we've built together. I love you. You're my wife, my partner, my best friend. The fact that you could even think... Then who is she, Dean? Really?" "I told you, she works for Albert Sterling. Sometimes she handles communications for the investors. That's all." He pulled me into his arms, and I let him, even though every instinct I had was screaming that this was wrong. "Baby, I know I've been distracted lately, and I know that's probably making you feel insecure. The Riverside deal is just so close to closing and there's so much pressure. But I promise you, there's no one else. There never could be." I wanted to believe him. God, how I wanted to believe him. But as he held me, all I could think about was the woman at the hotel, the way she'd touched his face, the way they'd gone upstairs together. Dean wasn't just lying to me about having an affair. He was lying about everything. And whatever he was really planning, whatever that boat and money transfer were about, I was starting to suspect it was much worse than just infidelity. After that confrontation about Angeline, Dean's behavior shifted into what I can only describe as overdrive charm mode. Suddenly, he was the perfect husband again, bringing me flowers for no reason, suggesting romantic dinner dates, talking enthusiastically about our future plans. It was like he'd flipped a switch, transforming back into the man I'd fallen in love with 9 years ago. "You know what we should do?" Dean said one evening in early December, pulling me close on the couch. "We should renew our wedding vows, maybe for our 10th anniversary next year. Something intimate, just close friends and family." I looked at him, this man who had been lying to me for months now talking about renewing our vows. "That sounds nice," I said, because what else could I say? "I've been thinking about what you said the other night," he continued, stroking my hair, "about feeling like I've been distant. You're right, and I'm sorry. This Riverside deal has consumed me, but that's no excuse for making you feel neglected. The Riverside deal." Even in his apologies, Dean couldn't stop lying, but his renewed attention came with something else, an urgency about our finances that I'd never seen before. Dean started bringing up money constantly, reviewing our accounts, together, discussing our financial security in ways that felt almost rehearsed. "I've been thinking," he said one night, spreading bank statements across our kitchen table, "we should consolidate our accounts, make everything simpler." "Simpler how?" I asked, scanning the papers. "Well, right now we've got checking accounts, savings accounts, my business accounts, your business account. It's scattered. What if we moved everything into one primary account? I could handle all the transfers, keep everything organized." I felt a chill run down my spine. "But I like having my own business account. It makes my taxes easier." Of course. Keep that for your business expenses." But for our personal stuff, our investments, the mortgage payments, wouldn't it be easier if I just managed all of that? You hate dealing with financial paperwork anyway. He wasn't wrong about that. I did hate financial paperwork. But something about this conversation felt wrong, like Dean was trying to solve a problem I didn't know we had. Is there some reason we need to consolidate everything right now? I asked. Dean's expression shifted, becoming more serious. Actually, yeah, there is. I've been talking to our financial advisor, and he thinks we're not maximizing our investment potential. If we consolidate our assets, we can move into some higher yield opportunities. But they require larger minimum investments than what we have in any individual account. Our financial advisor, another person I'd never actually met or spoken to, despite Dean's frequent references to his advice. What kind of investments? I pressed. International markets, mostly. Some offshore opportunities that could really pay off. But the window is closing fast. We'd need to move our money by the end of December to get in on the ground floor. Offshore investments. Money that would be much harder to track, much easier to hide. My father's voice echoed in my head from years ago. Jesse, if someone's pressuring you to make financial decisions quickly, especially involving offshore accounts, that's a red flag. Legitimate investments don't have arbitrary deadlines. I'd like to talk to this financial advisor myself, I said. Before we move any money. Dean's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Of course, I'll set up a meeting. But like I said, the timing is crucial. These opportunities don't wait around. That night, I lay awake thinking about everything Dean had said. The vow renewal, the account consolidation, the urgent offshore investments. It all felt connected somehow, like pieces of a puzzle I couldn't quite see clearly. The next day, while Dean was at another mysterious meeting, I called our bank and asked about our accounts. What I learned made my stomach drop. Dean had already started the consolidation process. 3 days earlier, he'd moved $50,000 from our savings account into checking. 2 days ago, another $75,000 had been transferred from our joint investment account. When I asked where the money had gone from checking, the representative told me it had been wired to an offshore account in the Cayman Islands. I'm sorry, I said, my voice shaking. Can you repeat that? An offshore account? Yes, ma'am. The transfer was authorized with both account holders' signatures, so it went through without any issues. Both signatures. I had never signed anything authorizing a transfer to the Cayman Islands. I had never even heard of Dean planning such a transfer. Can you email me copies of the authorization forms? I asked. Certainly, I'll send them right over. When the forms arrived in my inbox 10 minutes later, I stared at them in disbelief. There was my signature, perfectly forged, authorizing the transfer of $125,000 to an account I'd never heard of. Dean had been practicing my signature, perfecting it, preparing to steal our money without my knowledge. But this wasn't just theft. This was preparation for something bigger. You don't move money offshore unless you're planning to disappear. You don't forge your wife's signature unless you're planning to cut her out of the equation entirely. And suddenly, those life insurance policies we'd taken out 18 months ago took on a much more sinister meaning. Dean wasn't just planning to leave me. He was planning to make sure I could never come after him. He was planning to make me disappear. The boat, the money transfers, the fake death scheme I'd glimpsed in that initial hook. It was all starting to make horrifying sense. Dean was going to fake his own death, collect the insurance money, and start a new life with Angeline while I was left with nothing. Except I had a feeling that in Dean's version of this plan, I wasn't going to be left with anything at all. I was going to be left at the bottom of the ocean. Discovering the forged signature changed everything. This wasn't just about an affair anymore. This was about financial fraud, identity theft, and whatever dark plan Dean was orchestrating with that boat and those money transfers. I needed to understand exactly what I was dealing with, and I needed to do it without Dean realizing I was onto him. The next morning, after Dean left for another fake meeting, I did something that went against every instinct I'd had as a trusting wife. I broke into his home office. Dean had always been protective of his office space, not in an obvious way, but he'd made it clear that it was his domain. Just trying to keep work and home life separate, he'd always said when I'd offer to help organize his papers or clean his desk. Now I understood why. His filing cabinet was locked, but I found the key taped under his desk drawer, not exactly criminal mastermind-level security. Inside, I discovered a world of deception that took my breath away. There were documents for multiple businesses that didn't exist, fake contracts with fake clients for projects that were never going to happen, official-looking letterhead for Sterling Investment Group with Angeline Turner listed as Director of Client Relations. Not Albert Sterling, Angeline Turner. Dean had been using a fake name even in his lies to me. But the most chilling discovery was a manila folder labeled Insurance Claims Process. Inside were detailed instructions for how to file a life insurance claim, what documentation was required, and how long the investigation process typically took. There were printed articles about insurance fraud investigation procedures and a handwritten timeline that made my blood run cold. December 18th. Incident occurs. December 19th. Police report filed. December 20th. Family notification. Local news coverage. December 22nd. Insurance claim submitted. January 15th. Claim processing complete, funds released. January 16th. Final transfer to offshore account. December 18th was 5 days away. At the bottom of the folder was a boat, rental agreement for a 32-foot fishing boat, reserved for December 16th through December 20th. The renter was listed as Jensen Brooks, another name I'd heard Dean mention but had never actually met. The pickup location was a marina in Atlantic City, about an hour and a half from our house. My hands were shaking as I photographed every document with my phone. This wasn't just a plan. This was a detailed operational blueprint for Dean's fake death. But something about the timeline bothered me. If Dean was planning to fake his own death, why was he moving our money offshore beforehand? Wouldn't that raise red flags during the insurance investigation, unless he wasn't planning to fake his death alone? I found my answer in the last file in the cabinet, medical records. But not Dean's medical records. Mine. Copies of my recent physical exam, blood work results, even my dental records. There was also a life insurance claim form, partially filled out, with my name listed as the deceased. The room started spinning. Dean wasn't planning to fake his own death. He was planning to fake mine. Suddenly, everything made sense. The boat rental, the timeline, the urgent money transfers. Dean was going to kill me, make it look like an accident, collect my life insurance money, and disappear with Angeline to start a new life funded by my death. I sat in Dean's office chair, staring at my own death certificate template, trying to process the magnitude of what I'd discovered. The man I'd loved for 9 years, the man I'd built a life with, was planning to murder me for $3 million. But as the initial shock wore off, something else took its place. Anger. Cold, calculating anger that felt surprisingly familiar. Maybe I was more my father's daughter than I'd realized. I carefully put everything back exactly as I'd found it, but not before taking detailed photos of every document. Then I did something that would have seemed impossible just hours earlier. I started planning my own counter-strategy. The first thing I needed was help, but I couldn't go to just anyone. If Dean was willing to commit murder, he certainly wouldn't hesitate to hurt anyone who tried to help me. I needed someone with resources, someone who understood criminal behavior, someone who couldn't be easily intimidated. I needed my father. Detective Lieutenant Albert Morrison and I hadn't spoken in 5 years, not since our fight about Dean. My father had never liked my husband, said there was something off about him that he couldn't put his finger on. I'd accused him of being overprotective, of not wanting his little girl to grow up. We'd said terrible things to each other, and pride had kept us apart ever since. But pride was a luxury I couldn't afford when my life was at stake. That evening, while Dean was supposedly having dinner with clients, I drove to my father's house in Newark. It was a small ranch-style home in a working-class neighborhood, exactly the opposite of the upscale lifestyle Dean and I maintained in Westfield. My father answered the door in his undershirt and reading glasses, looking older than I remembered but still sharp-eyed and suspicious. "Jessica," he said, his voice carefully neutral. "This is unexpected." "Dad," I said, and then, because there was no easy way to say it, "I think my husband is planning to kill me." My father looked at me for a long moment, then stepped aside to let me in. "Come inside. Tell me everything." As I sat in my childhood living room, showing my father the photos of Dean's murder plan, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years. Safety. My father listened without interruption, his expression growing darker with each revelation. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Jessica, how much do you trust me?" "With my life," I said, and meant it. "Good, because we're going to catch this bastard, but first we need to make sure you're safe. And then, we're going to give him a surprise he'll never forget." My father and I spent 3 hours that night developing what he called operational security. We couldn't just go to the police with stolen documents and accusations. We needed Dean to reveal his plan himself, preferably with multiple law enforcement agencies as witnesses. "The problem," my father explained, "is that everything you found could be explained away by a good lawyer. Fake business documents could be called aspirational planning. The boat rental could be a surprise vacation. Even your medical records could be explained as Dean handling insurance paperwork." "But the timeline," I protested. "The step-by-step murder plan, written in his own handwriting with no witnesses," my father said grimly. "His lawyer would claim it was notes for a crime novel, research for a business thriller, anything except an actual murder plot. We need him to either attempt the crime or confess to it while we're recording." We decided on a combination approach. My father would coordinate with the FBI, financial fraud across state lines made this a federal case, while I would continue playing the unsuspecting wife, giving Dean enough rope to hang himself. "The key," my father said, "is to let him think his plan is working while we document everything. When he makes his move on December 18th, we'll be ready." But Dean had other ideas. 2 days later, on December 14th, 4 days ahead of his original schedule, Dean came home with an announcement that made my blood freeze. "Surprise," he said, producing 2 plane tickets from his jacket pocket. "I booked us a long weekend getaway. We fly out tomorrow morning." I stared at the tickets. Nassau, Bahamas. Departure, December 15th at 8:30 a.m. Return, December 18th at 6:45 p.m. "Tomorrow?" I managed. "But Dean, I have client meetings scheduled and—" "Cancel them," Dean said, pulling me into his arms. "I know I've been distracted lately, and I want to make it up to you. 3 days of sun, sand, and just us. No work, no stress, no distractions." My mind was racing. This wasn't part of the timeline I'd found. December 18th was supposed to be the incident date, but now Dean was planning to have us back in New Jersey that evening. Unless the incident was going to happen in the Bahamas. I forced a smile. "It sounds wonderful, but such short notice—" "That's what makes it exciting," Dean said, his eyes bright with an enthusiasm that now seemed sinister. "I've already arranged everything, the hotel, the activities, even a special surprise. For our last day there, a special surprise. On December 18th. "What kind of surprise?" I asked, trying to keep my voice light. "Well, it wouldn't be a surprise if I told you, would it?" Dean laughed. Let's just say it involves the ocean, and something I know you've always wanted to try. I had never expressed any interest in ocean activities. I was actually a terrible swimmer, something Dean knew perfectly well. The fact that he was planning an ocean-based surprise for someone who could barely tread water sent a clear message about his intentions. That night, while Dean slept beside me, I texted my father using a burner phone he'd given me. Plans changed. Nassau tomorrow. Ocean activity 18th. Need backup. His response came within minutes. FBI already coordinating with Bahamian authorities. You're not going alone. Trust the process. The next morning, as we headed to Newark Airport, I noticed Dean was unusually talkative, almost manic in his excitement. He kept checking his phone, texting someone, and making cryptic comments about how everything was falling into place perfectly. At the airport, while Dean was in the bathroom, I saw her. Angeline Turner, standing near our gate, wearing sunglasses and a floppy hat like she was trying to disguise herself. She was holding a boarding pass for the same flight. When Dean returned, he didn't seem surprised to see her. In fact, he walked directly over to where she was sitting. "Jessica," he said, his arm around my waist. "I want you to meet Angeline Turner. She's actually going to Nassau for business, and I thought since we're all on the same flight, maybe we could show her around a bit. You know how I hate to see a fellow traveler stuck alone in a foreign place." Angeline stood up and extended her hand. She was younger than I'd thought, probably mid-20s, with perfect blonde hair and the kind of smile that didn't reach her eyes. "So nice to meet you, Jessica," she said. "Dean's told me so much about you." I'll bet he has, I thought, but I smiled and shook her hand. "Likewise. What kind of business brings you to Nassau?" "Insurance consulting," she said smoothly. "I specialize in accident investigation and claims processing." The audacity was breathtaking. Dean was introducing me to my future murderer, and she was telling me to my face that she specialized in insurance fraud. They were so confident in their plan, so certain I was too naive to understand what was happening, that they were practically confessing. During the flight, I watched them interact. They were careful not to be too familiar with each other, but I caught the small touches, the shared glances, the way Angeline would laugh a little too hard at Dean's jokes. They were definitely lovers, but more than that, they were partners in crime. As our plane descended toward Nassau, Dean squeezed my hand and pointed out the window at the crystal blue water below. "Beautiful, isn't it?" he said. "So deep, so mysterious. They say the ocean keeps all its secrets." I squeezed his hand back. "Not all of them," I said quietly. Dean looked at me sharply, but I was already turning away to gather my carry-on bag. In just 3 days, he was planning to make me disappear into that beautiful, mysterious ocean. What he didn't know was that I'd already arranged for some secrets of my own. The game was about to begin, and this time, I was ready to play. The Atlantis Resort in Nassau was everything Dean had promised: luxury suites overlooking turquoise, water, world-class restaurants, and enough activities to keep any couple busy for a week. Under normal circumstances, it would have been the perfect romantic getaway. Instead, it felt like the most beautiful prison I'd ever been trapped in. Dean had booked us a junior suite on the 14th floor with a panoramic view of the harbor. As I stood on our balcony that first afternoon, watching boats come and go, in the distance, I couldn't help but wonder which one would be involved in my planned murder. "Gorgeous view, isn't it?" Dean said, coming up behind me and wrapping his arms around my waist. "I thought we could spend tomorrow exploring the resort, maybe do some shopping in town. And then Sunday." He paused, kissing my neck. "Sunday, we're going to do something really special." Sunday, December 18th, the original date from his timeline. "What kind of special?" I asked, leaning back against him and trying to sound excited rather than terrified. "It's a surprise," Dean said, but I could hear the satisfaction in his voice. "Let's just say it's something that will change everything for us." That evening at dinner, Angeline appeared again, this time wearing a flowing white dress that made her look like she belonged in a resort brochure. She approached our table with a bright smile and an Oscar-worthy performance of surprise. "Dean, Jessica, what a coincidence running into you here," she said, as if Nassau wasn't exactly where we'd all planned to be. Dean stood up and pulled out a chair for her. "Angeline, please join us. How was your first day in paradise?" As she sat down, I noticed she was wearing an expensive watch and a diamond tennis bracelet that definitely hadn't come from an insurance consultant's salary. Dean's money, my money, was already funding her new lifestyle. "Oh, it's been wonderful," Angeline said, settling into the chair like she belonged there. "Though I have to admit, I'm a little nervous about tomorrow." "Tomorrow?" I asked innocently. "My client meeting," she said quickly. "Big insurance case. A boat accident, actually. Very complicated." Dean's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Angeline was ad-libbing, going off script, and he didn't like it. "How unfortunate," I said. "I hope everyone involved is okay." "Well, that's the thing about accidents," Angeline said, twirling her wine glass. "You never know how they're going to turn out until it's all over." The conversation continued for another hour, with Dean and Angeline maintaining their charade while dropping increasingly obvious hints about their real relationship. Dean's hand would briefly touch Angeline's when he passed her the salt. Angeline would laugh at his jokes with the intimacy of someone who'd heard them before. They were like actors who'd rehearsed their roles, but couldn't quite hide their natural chemistry. What they didn't know was that I was recording everything. My father had given me a small device that looked like a normal phone charger, but was actually transmitting audio directly to FBI agents positioned throughout the resort. Every word they said, every careless admission, was being documented as evidence. After dinner, Dean suggested we all go for a walk along the beach. As we strolled along the sand, he pointed out various boats anchored in the harbor. "Look at that beauty," he said, indicating a sleek white yacht about 40 feet long. "That's a Sunseeker Predator. Probably costs more than our house." "Do you know much about boats?" I asked. "A little," Dean said casually. "Been thinking about maybe chartering one while we're here. Take you out for a sunset cruise or something." A sunset cruise. On December 18th, in deep water, far from shore, where an accident could happen and a body might never be found. "That sounds romantic," I said, squeezing his arm. "But you know I'm not a strong swimmer." "Don't worry," Dean said, his smile never wavering. "I'll take good care of you." The threat was so casual, so perfectly delivered with a loving tone, that anyone overhearing would think he was being protective. But I heard the real message: "I'll make sure you don't suffer too much." That night, as Dean slept beside me, I lay awake processing the surreal reality of my situation. In less than 36 hours, the man next to me was planning to take me out on a boat and kill me. He would then return to shore with Angeline, claim I'd fallen overboard in a tragic accident, and begin his new life funded by my insurance money. But what Dean didn't realize was that while he was setting his trap, I was setting one of my own. The FBI agents weren't just recording our conversations, they were also tracking the yacht he'd been eyeing, monitoring Angeline's communications, and coordinating with Bahamian law enforcement to ensure that when Dean made his move, we'd be ready. My phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "All systems go. Sunday will be a day he never forgets. Stay strong. A.M. My father." Even though we'd been estranged for years, he was watching over me, making sure I was protected. For the first time since discovering Dean's plan, I felt something other than fear. I felt anticipation. Dean thought he was so clever, so in control. He had no idea that his perfect victim had become his perfect nemesis. Sunday couldn't come fast enough. Saturday morning arrived with perfect weather, clear skies, gentle breeze, and water so blue it looked artificial. Dean was in an exceptional mood, practically bouncing with energy as he suggested we spend the day exploring Nassau before our big surprise tomorrow. I played my part perfectly, the excited wife enjoying a romantic getaway with her devoted husband. We toured the resort's aquarium, where Dean made several pointed comments about how peaceful the fish looked, how beautiful it would be to sleep with the fishes in such clear water. We shopped in the resort boutiques, where Dean insisted on buying me an expensive white dress. "For tonight," he said, kissing my forehead. "I want you to look perfect for our special dinner." The white dress felt like a shroud, but I smiled and thanked him, playing the grateful wife who had no idea she was selecting her own funeral outfit. At lunch, Angeline joined us again, this time with what she claimed was exciting news about her business meeting. "Everything's confirmed for tomorrow," she announced, barely able to contain her enthusiasm. "The weather's going to be perfect, the boat is ready, and my client is very excited about resolving this case once and for all." Dean shot her a warning. Look, she was being too obvious, too excited about a supposed insurance consultation. But Angeline was young and inexperienced at criminal conspiracy. She couldn't hide her anticipation about finally getting her hands on $3 million. "What kind of insurance case requires such perfect weather?" I asked innocently. "Maritime insurance," Angeline said quickly. "We need to recreate the conditions of the original accident for the investigation." "That sounds dangerous," I said, putting just the right amount of concern in my voice. "Will you be safe out there on the water?" "Oh, don't worry about me," Angeline laughed. "I'm an excellent swimmer, and I'll have Dean there to protect me." The slip was so obvious that Dean actually choked on his drink. She just admitted that Dean would be with her during her supposed business meeting, completely destroying their cover story. "What I meant," Angeline said, backtracking frantically, "is that Dean offered to help with the technical aspects. He knows boats, and maritime accidents can be very complex to reconstruct." I nodded sympathetically, as if I believed every word. How thoughtful of him to help. Dean's always been so good at solving problems. That afternoon, while Dean took what he claimed was an important business call, I had my own meeting. Agent Sarah Chen, no relation to any Chen Dean might know, approached me at the resort spa, posing as another guest getting a massage. "Everything's in place," she whispered as we lay side by side on massage tables. "We've got surveillance on the yacht he chartered, tracking devices on both Dean and Angeline, and a Coast Guard cutter positioned just out of sight. The moment he makes his move, we'll be there." "What if something goes wrong?" I asked quietly. "It won't," Agent Chen assured me. "We've done this before. Just stick to the plan, act surprised when he reveals the boat trip, show appropriate enthusiasm, and whatever you do, don't get on that boat until you see our signal." "What's the signal?" "A red flare from the Coast Guard vessel. When you see it, you'll know we're moving in." That evening, Dean took me to dinner at the resort's most expensive restaurant. He ordered champagne, proposed multiple toasts to our future together, and spoke eloquently about how much our relationship meant to him. "You know," he said, reaching across the table to hold my hand, "I was thinking today about how lucky I am, how perfect our life together has been." Has been. I noted the past tense. "Is," Dean corrected quickly. "How perfect our life is. And tomorrow, I want to show you just how much you mean to me." The irony was staggering. Dean was giving me a farewell dinner, saying goodbye to his wife before murdering her, and he seemed genuinely emotional about it. Either he was a better actor than I'd given him credit for, or some part of him actually felt bad about what he was planning to do. "I love you too," I said, squeezing his hand. "I can't wait to see what you have planned." As we walked back to our room after dinner, Dean's phone buzzed with a text. I caught a glimpse of the screen. "Everything ready for tomorrow. Boat fueled, route planned, cleanup arranged. She won't know what hit her." Angeline wasn't even bothering to use code names anymore. They were so confident in their plan, so certain I was too naive to understand what was happening, that they were being careless. That carelessness would be their downfall. Back in our suite, Dean was more attentive than he'd been in months. He ran me a bath, brought me wine, and spent an hour just talking about our memories together, our first date, our wedding, the early years of our marriage when everything felt possible. "Do you ever think about what would happen if one of us died?" he asked suddenly, his voice soft in the darkness. "Sometimes," I admitted, "but I try not to dwell on it." "Why?" "Just promise me that if anything ever happens to me, you'll remember the good times. Remember how much I loved you." I turned to face him in the dim light. "Dean, you're scaring me. Is everything okay?" "Everything's perfect," he said, pulling me close. "Tomorrow's going to be perfect too. I promise." As Dean fell asleep beside me, I lay awake thinking about his words. Some part of him did love me, the way a person loves a possession they're about to discard. He was grieving our relationship even as he planned to end my life. But I wasn't ready to be grieved. Tomorrow, Dean would discover that his perfect victim had become his perfect trap. Sunday morning, December 18th, arrived with an almost mocking beauty. The sun painted the water gold, seabirds called from crystal clear skies, and a gentle breeze carried the scent of hibiscus from the resort gardens. It was the kind of morning that belonged in tourist brochures, not criminal conspiracies. Dean woke up energized, practically vibrating with anticipation. He ordered room service breakfast and insisted we eat on the balcony, pointing out various boats in the harbor as if he were a casual sailing enthusiast rather than a man planning his wife's murder. "See that white yacht there?" he said, indicating a sleek vessel about a quarter-mile offshore. "That's a Sunseeker Predator 40. Perfect for deep-sea fishing, or just getting away from everything." I followed his gaze, noting that it was the same yacht he'd admired 2 nights earlier. "It's beautiful. Very isolated looking." "That's the point," Dean said, his smile never wavering. "Sometimes you need to get completely away from civilization to really appreciate what you have." After breakfast, Dean announced it was time for my surprise. "I've arranged something special for us today, a private yacht charter with an experienced captain. We're going to spend the day on the water, just the 2 of us." "Just the 2 of us?" I asked, though I already knew Angeline would be joining. "Us?" "Well, actually, I ran into Angeline this morning, and her business meeting got canceled at the last minute. I felt bad for her being stuck here alone, so I invited her to come along. Hope you don't mind." The lie rolled off his tongue so smoothly I almost believed it myself. Of course not. The more the merrier. As we prepared to leave, Dean handed me a life jacket. "Safety first," he said. But when I examined it, I noticed something chilling. The CO2 cartridge that was supposed to inflate the vest had been punctured. This life jacket wouldn't save anyone. It was just another prop in Dean's elaborate murder scene. "This one looks defective," I said, showing him the damaged cartridge. Dean examined it with feigned concern. "Oh, you're right. How careless of the rental company. Don't worry, there are plenty more on the boat." Of course there were. All probably sabotaged, just like this one. We met Angeline at the marina, where she was waiting with a man Dean introduced as Captain Brody Williams. He was a weathered local in his 50s, with calloused hands and the deep tan of someone who'd spent his life on the water. What struck me immediately was how nervous he seemed, constantly checking his watch, avoiding eye contact, and speaking in short, clipped sentences. "Beautiful day for sailing," I said to him as we boarded the yacht. "Yeah," he muttered. "Should be eventful." Eventful. Not peaceful, not relaxing. Eventful. This man knew exactly what was supposed to happen today. As we pulled away from the marina, I noticed several other boats in the area. A fishing charter about 100 yards to our starboard, a Coast Guard training vessel conducting exercises in the distance, and what looked like a pleasure craft filled with tourists taking photos. To anyone else, it would have seemed like a busy but normal day on the water. But I recognized the careful positioning, the way these boats were maintaining specific distances from our yacht. My father's backup plan was in motion. Dean was playing the perfect host, pointing out landmarks along the Nassau coastline, offering me champagne, and making casual conversation about our plans for the rest of the vacation. But I could see the tension in his shoulders, the way he kept checking his watch, the meaningful glances he exchanged with Angeline. About 30 minutes into our trip, when we were well away from shore and other traffic, Dean made his announcement. "Thought we'd anchor in that quiet cove over there," he said, pointing to an isolated inlet surrounded by rocky outcroppings. "Perfect for swimming and just relaxing." Swimming. The key word in his plan: get me in the water, where an accident could happen naturally. "That sounds wonderful," I said, then paused as if something had just occurred to me. "But Dean, you know I'm not comfortable swimming in deep water." "Don't worry," Angeline said, quickly. "I'm a certified lifeguard. I'll make sure you're safe." I looked at her with what I hoped was grateful surprise. Really? What a coincidence. I feel so much better knowing there's a professional here. As Captain Williams maneuvered the yacht toward the isolated cove, I noticed Dean and Angeline exchanging glances. This was it. They were moving into the final phase of their plan. In a few minutes, they would suggest I go swimming, probably offering to help me into the water. Once I was in, they would either hold me under or simply wait for me to drown, then return to shore with a tragic story about a swimming accident. But as we approached the cove, something unexpected happened. Dean's phone started buzzing incessantly. He looked at the screen and his face went white. "What's wrong?" I asked innocently. It's my business partner," Dean said, his voice tight with panic. "There's some kind of emergency with the Riverside project." The Riverside project. Even in crisis, Dean couldn't stop lying about his fictional business deals. "Maybe you should answer it," I suggested. Dean hesitated, clearly, torn between maintaining his facade and dealing with whatever crisis was developing. Finally, he answered the call. "Jensen? What do you mean the FBI is asking questions? What FBI? Slow down, I can't—" He stopped abruptly, his face draining of all color. On the other end of the line, I could hear a man's voice, urgent and panicked, though I couldn't make out the words. "When?" Dean whispered into the phone. "How much do they know?" Angeline was watching him with growing alarm. "What's going on?" she hissed. Dean ended the call and turned to Captain Williams. "Turn around. We need to go back. Now." "What about—" Angeline started. "Now!" Dean shouted. But as Captain Williams reached for the controls, something remarkable happened. A red flare arced across the sky from the direction of the Coast Guard vessel. The signal. It was time. The red flare changed everything. In the space of 30 seconds, our yacht went from being the scene of a planned murder to the center of a federal law enforcement operation. The fishing charter that had been maintaining distance suddenly roared to life, racing toward us with unmistakable authority. The Coast Guard training exercise vessel turned and began closing in from the opposite direction. Even the tourist boat revealed itself to be anything but casual sightseers. Dean stood frozen at the rail, watching his carefully orchestrated plan disintegrate before his eyes. Angeline was frantically looking between the approaching boats. And Dean, finally understanding that their perfect crime had become a perfect trap. "What's happening?" she demanded. "Dean, what's happening?" But Dean couldn't answer. He was staring at me with a look of dawning comprehension that was almost satisfying to watch. For the first time in our entire relationship, he was seeing me, clearly, not as the naive, trusting wife he could manipulate, but as the woman who had outmaneuvered him at every turn. "You knew," he said quietly. You knew all along. I stood up slowly, no longer needing to maintain my facade of helpless innocence. I knew about the forged signatures. I knew about the offshore accounts. I knew about your timeline, your boat, rental, your fake business documents. I knew about Angeline, about your plan to kill me for the insurance money. I knew everything, Dean. Captain Williams was desperately trying to restart the yacht's engine, which had mysteriously died the moment the flare went up. "The engine's not responding," he called out, panic clear in his voice. "That's because it's been remotely disabled," I said calmly. "Along with your radio communications and GPS navigation, you're not going anywhere." The first law enforcement vessel reached us within minutes. FBI agents in tactical gear swarmed onto the yacht, their weapons drawn and voices commanding immediate compliance. Agent Chen, the woman who had posed as a spa guest, was among them, no longer needing to maintain her cover. Dean Matthews, Angeline. "Turner, Brody Williams," she announced with professional authority. "You're under arrest for conspiracy to commit murder, insurance fraud, money laundering, and about a dozen other federal crimes." Dean's legs gave out, and he collapsed into one of the yacht's deck chairs. The man who had been so confident, so certain he could outsmart everyone, looked suddenly old and broken. "How?" he whispered. "How did you know?" I walked over to where he sat looking down at the husband who had planned to murder me for money. "You want to know how I knew? You want to understand where your perfect plan went wrong?" He nodded, still in shock. "It started with that phone call from A. Sterling," I said. 17 missed calls from someone who supposedly didn't exist online. That made me start paying attention to details I'd been ignoring. Your fake business cards, your non-existent meetings, your lies about social events I could easily verify. Angeline was being handcuffed nearby, but she was listening to every word, her face a mask of disbelief. "Then there was the offshore money transfer with my forged signature," I continued. "Did you really think I wouldn't notice $125,000 disappearing from our account? Or that I wouldn't recognize my own signature being copied?" Dean closed his eyes. "You called the bank." "I called the bank. I called the planning commission. I called everyone you claimed to be meeting with. And when I realized you were lying about everything, I did what any smart woman would do. I investigated further." "The office," Dean said, understanding flooding his features. "You went through my office." "I found your murder timeline, Dean. December 18th. Incident occurs. Your boat rental agreement. Your research on insurance claim procedures. My medical records, which you had no business possessing. And most damning of all, the life insurance claim form with my name as the deceased." Agent Chen was reading rights to Captain Williams, who was cooperating fully, apparently hoping to reduce his sentence by providing information about Dean and Angeline's operation. "But the thing that really sealed your fate," I said, "was underestimating who you married. You thought I was just some naive marketing consultant who'd never question your authority. You forgot that I'm Detective Lieutenant Albert Morrison's daughter. You forgot that I grew up learning how to recognize lies, how to gather evidence, and how to build an airtight case." "Your father," Dean said, the pieces finally clicking into place. "You went to your father. I went to my father. And do you know what he said when I told him my husband was planning to kill me? He said he'd been waiting 5 years for me to realize what kind of man you really were." The irony wasn't lost on me. The estrangement between my father and me, caused by his suspicions about Dean, had ultimately been what saved my life. My father's cop instincts had been right all along, and when I finally needed him, he was ready with resources I never could have accessed on my own. "The FBI has been watching you for weeks," I continued, "recording your phone calls, tracking your financial transactions, documenting your relationship with Angeline, every lie you told, every move you made, every detail of your murder plan. It's all on record." Dean looked up at me with what might have been admiration if the circumstances were different. You played me. I learned from the best, I said. You taught me how to lie convincingly, how to maintain a facade, how to make people see what you want them to see. I just used those lessons against you. As the agents prepared to transport the 3 conspirators back to shore, Dean made one last desperate attempt to salvage something from the wreckage of his plan. Jessica? He said, his voice breaking. I know you probably can't forgive me, but you have to believe that I loved you. Some part of me really did love you. I looked at him for a long moment. This man who had shared my bed while planning my death, who had kissed me goodnight while counting down the days until my murder. I believe you, I said finally. The same way you loved our house, our cars, our lifestyle. You loved me like a possession, Dean. And when possessions become inconvenient, you throw them away. The boats carrying my would-be killers disappeared toward Nassau, leaving me alone on the water with the FBI agents and the stunning realization that I was finally, truly free. As the Coast Guard vessel transported me back to Nassau, Agent Chen sat beside me, reviewing the evidence we'd collected over the past 3 weeks. The scope of Dean's deception was even more extensive than I'd initially realized, and the strategic planning required to counter it had been unlike anything I'd ever imagined myself capable of. What you accomplished here, Agent Chen said, closing her laptop. Most people couldn't have pulled off with years of training. You orchestrated a federal investigation, coordinated international law enforcement, and maintained deep cover while your life was in immediate danger. That takes a special kind of person. I stared out at the water, still processing everything that had happened. 3 weeks ago, I was just a marketing consultant who thought her biggest problem was a cheating husband. I had no idea I was capable of any of this. Your father said you'd surprise yourself. Agent Chen smiled. He was right. The revelation about my own capabilities was almost as shocking as discovering Dean's murder plot. When I'd first found those documents in Dean's office, I'd been terrified and overwhelmed. But somewhere between calling my father and stepping onto that yacht, I'd transformed into someone I barely recognized. Someone strategic, patient, and ruthlessly effective. There's something else you should know, Agent Chen continued. The financial investigation uncovered the full scope of Dean's operation. The offshore accounts, the fake businesses, the forged documents. This wasn't just about your insurance money. Dean and Angeline were running a sophisticated fraud operation targeting multiple victims. I turned to look at her. Multiple victims? At least 6 other wives over the past 3 years. Similar patterns. Wealthy women with substantial life. Insurance policies, isolated locations, boating accidents. We think you were number 7. The magnitude of what Dean had been doing hit me like a physical blow. I hadn't just been married to a man planning to kill me for money. I'd been married to a serial killer. A man who made a living murdering women who trusted him. Did any of them? I couldn't finish the question. 3 of them died in accidents before we connected the pattern. That's what made your case so crucial. You were our first real chance to catch him in the act. I closed my eyes, thinking about those 3 women who hadn't been as lucky as I was. Women who probably loved Dean the way I had, who trusted him completely, who never saw the danger coming. If I hadn't grown up as a cop's daughter, if I hadn't noticed those early warning signs, if I hadn't had the resources to fight back, I would have been victim number 4. The irony, I said quietly, is that Dean created his own downfall. By lying to me for so long, by making me suspicious of everything he said and did, he taught me to question his story when it really mattered. Agent Chen nodded. Criminals often get caught because they can't help themselves. They become overconfident, careless. Dean thought he'd chosen the perfect victim in you, a trusting wife with no law enforcement connections, substantial assets, and no reason to suspect him. Instead, He chose someone whose father had been warning her about him for 5 years. And someone smart enough to turn his own methods against him. As Nassau's harbor came into view, I realized that while Dean's arrest was the end of his story, it was just the beginning of mine. Back at FBI headquarters in Nassau, I found myself in the surreal position of helping federal agents build the case against my own husband. The conference room was filled with evidence boards covered in photographs, financial documents, and timeline charts that painted a comprehensive picture of Dean's criminal enterprise. "Your recordings were crucial," Agent Chen explained, pointing to transcripts of conversations I'd captured over the past 3 weeks. Dean's admissions about the boat timeline, Angeline's references to accident reconstruction, and Captain Williams's confirmation of the murder plan. It's all admissible evidence. I stared at the wall of documentation, still amazed at how much I'd managed to gather while pretending to be an oblivious wife. The burner phone my father had given me had recorded over 40 hours of conversations. The tracking device sewn into my purse had documented every location Dean had taken me, including his secret meetings with Angeline and Jensen Brooks, the man who'd been coordinating the boat rentals and providing fake identification documents. "Tell me about Jensen," I said, studying his photograph on the evidence board. "Real name is Jensen Crawford, former insurance investigator turned criminal. He's been Dean's partner in this operation from the beginning, handling the logistics, forging documents, even recruiting the boat captains. We arrested him this morning at the marina in Atlantic City." The scope of the conspiracy was staggering. What I'd initially thought was a simple affair had revealed itself to be a sophisticated criminal network involving insurance fraud, identity theft, money laundering, and multiple murders across 3 states and 2 countries. "Here's what really impressed our financial crimes unit," Agent Chen continued, showing me a complex flowchart of money transfers. "You didn't just discover Dean's offshore accounts. You actually helped us trace funds from previous victims. Remember when you told us about that $125,000 transfer you caught?" I nodded. "The one with my forged signature." That led us to accounts containing money from at least 6 other insurance payouts. Dean and Angeline had been perfecting this system for years, targeting wealthy women in stable marriages, building relationships over months or even years before executing their plans. Looking at the evidence, I could see the pattern clearly now. Dean hadn't randomly chosen me at that charity gala 9 years ago. He'd been hunting. He'd identified me as a target. Successful, financially stable, estranged from family who might ask uncomfortable questions and naive enough to trust completely. "The most important evidence, though," Agent Chen said, "came from your decision to play along with his plan. By letting Dean think you were still the trusting wife, you gave us the chance to document his methodology in real time. The sabotaged life jacket, the isolated cove location, the coordinated timing with Angeline's arrival. We never could have proven premeditation without your cooperation." I thought about those terrifying final days in Nassau, knowing Dean was planning to kill me while I smiled and played the perfect victim. "I kept thinking about those other women," I said. "The ones who didn't make it. I couldn't let him do this to anyone else." "Well, he won't. Between the evidence you helped us gather and the testimony from Captain Williams, who's cooperating fully in exchange for a reduced sentence, Dean and Angeline are looking at life in prison without parole." The justice felt satisfying, but incomplete. 3 women were still dead because of Dean's greed, their families still believing their deaths were tragic accidents rather than calculated murders. "What happens to the families of the other victims?" I asked. "They'll finally get answers, and thanks to your case, they'll also get justice." The weeks following Dean's arrest were a strange combination of relief and anticipation. I'd returned to our house in Westfield, though it no longer felt like our house, just a place where I'd once lived with a stranger who'd planned to kill me. Every room held memories that I was slowly rewriting, understanding them now through the lens of truth, rather than the carefully constructed lies Dean had fed me for years. My father visited daily during those first weeks, something that would have been unimaginable just a month earlier. We spent hours talking, not just about the case, but about the 5 years we'd lost to pride and stubbornness. He'd been right about Dean from the beginning, but he was gracious enough not to say, "I told you so. You did what you had to do," he said one evening as we sat in my kitchen, the same kitchen where Dean had planned my murder while drinking coffee and reading fake business documents. "I'm proud of how you handled yourself. Most people would have panicked, made mistakes, gotten themselves killed." "I almost did panic," I admitted. "There were moments when I wanted to just run, disappear, start over somewhere else. But you didn't. You stayed, you fought back, and you won." Meanwhile, the legal machinery was moving forward with methodical precision. Dean, Angeline, and Jensen were being held without bail pending trial. Captain Williams had pled guilty to conspiracy charges and was cooperating fully with prosecutors, providing details about the murder operation that even the FBI hadn't uncovered. The media attention was intense but manageable. "Local woman exposes husband's murder plot" had been front-page news in New Jersey for 3 days running. I'd given one carefully scripted interview to a local television station, mainly to ensure the story was told accurately, then refused all other media requests. What surprised me most during this waiting period was how normal I felt. I'd expected trauma, nightmares, an inability to trust anyone ever again. Instead, I felt clear-headed and purposeful in a way I hadn't experienced in years. It was as if exposing Dean's lies had freed me from a fog I didn't even realize I'd been living in. The financial situation was complex but promising. Dean's assets were frozen pending the criminal trial, but the FBI assured me that as the victim of his fraud, I'd recover most of our legitimate holdings. The offshore accounts were being repatriated, and the life insurance companies were eager to settle rather than face public scrutiny about how easily their systems had been gamed. "You're going to come out of this financially secure," my attorney explained during one of our meetings. "Dean's crimes actually worked in your favor. Everything he stole or attempted to steal will be returned with interest." But the most satisfying development came 3 weeks after Dean's arrest, when Agent Chen called with news that would change everything. "We've located 2 more potential victims," she said. "Women who are currently married to men following Dean's exact pattern. Your case gave us the template to identify them before it's too late. Are they safe?" "They will be. We're moving on both situations today. Because of what you did, Jessica, we're going to save lives." That phone call made everything, the fear, the deception, the months of living with a man planning my death, worthwhile. Dean's perfect crime had become the key to stopping other perfect crimes. 2 months after Dean's arrest, I received a call that I'd been both expecting and dreading. Dean's attorney had reached out through official channels, requesting a meeting. Dean wanted to see me. According to his lawyer, he had information about other victims that he was willing to share, but only if he could speak to me directly. "It's obviously a manipulation tactic," Agent Chen warned me during our strategy session. "He's trying to use your compassion against you, hoping you'll advocate for a plea deal." But my father saw it differently. "He's desperate," he said. "Men like Dean can't accept that they've been outsmarted, especially by someone they considered beneath them. He needs to try to regain some control, even if it's just psychological." I thought about it for days before making my decision. Dean had spent months planning my death, lying to me every day while counting down to my murder. He'd stolen our money, forged my signature, and conspired with his mistress to kill me for insurance money. If he thought he could manipulate me one more time, he was about to learn just how much I'd changed. "I'll see him," I told Agent Chen, "but on my terms." The meeting was arranged for the following week at the Federal Detention Center in Manhattan. I spent days preparing, not just emotionally but strategically. This wasn't going to be a tearful, Reunion or a chance for Dean to apologize his way back into my life. This was going to be the final move in a chess game he'd started, but I was going to finish. The night before the meeting, my father and I had dinner at the same restaurant where Dean and I had celebrated our 5th wedding anniversary. It felt like a lifetime ago, back when I believed his stories about successful business deals and thought his secretiveness was just professional discretion. "Are you sure you're ready for this?" my father asked as we reviewed the plan one final time. "I've been ready since the moment I found those documents in his office," I said. "Dean thinks he knows me, thinks he can still manipulate the woman he married. But that woman doesn't exist anymore." The truth was, I had my own agenda for this meeting. While Dean thought he was getting a chance to manipulate me, I was actually setting the final trap. The FBI needed confirmation of his involvement in the 3 previous murders, admissions that only I could get him to make. Dean's narcissism and need to be seen as clever would be his ultimate downfall. "Remember," Agent Chen had coached me, "he'll try to make you feel guilty, try to convince you that what you did was worse than what he planned. Don't let him rewrite history." "He can try," I said. "But I'm not the same person who used to believe his lies." As I drove to Manhattan the next morning, I thought about the journey that had brought me to this moment. 6 months ago, I'd been a naive wife who trusted completely and questioned nothing. Now I was a woman who had single-handedly dismantled a murder conspiracy and saved lives in the process. Dean was about to meet the person I'd become, and I couldn't wait to see his reaction when he realized that his perfect victim had become his perfect nemesis. The final confrontation was about to begin. The Federal Detention Center in Manhattan was exactly as cold and institutional as I'd expected. As I sat in the visitor's room, waiting for Dean to be brought in, I felt surprisingly calm. The woman who had once trembled at the thought of confronting her husband about suspicious credit card charges was gone. In her place sat someone who had orchestrated a federal investigation and was about to extract final confessions from a serial killer. When Dean walked through the door in his orange jumpsuit and shackles, I barely recognized him. The confident, charming man who had swept me off my feet 9 years ago looked hollow, aged, defeated. Prison had stripped away his expensive suits and perfect smile, revealing the predator underneath. "Jessica," he said, sitting across from me, with the metal table between us. "You came." I said I would. "You look good." Different, but good. He was studying my face, trying to read me the way he always had. "I wasn't sure you'd want to see me after everything. After you tried to murder me for $3 million? I kept my voice level, clinical. "I wasn't sure either," Dean flinched. "It wasn't supposed to be like that. Things got complicated, out of control. The pressure from the investors, the debt situation." "What investors, Dean? What debt?" "Sterling. Investment group doesn't exist. The Riverside project never existed. You've been lying to me for years." For a moment, his mask slipped completely. "You really did figure it all out, didn't you? Every detail, including the 3 women you killed before me." Dean's eyes widened. 3 women? Jessica, I never... Patricia Henley in Connecticut. Drowned during a sailing accident with her husband in 2021. Margaret Foster in Rhode Island. Fell overboard during a sunset cruise in 2022. Diana Walsh in Massachusetts. Swimming accident during a romantic weekend getaway just last year. I recited the names like a prosecutor reading charges. All wealthy, all had substantial life insurance policies, all died in boating accidents with their loving husbands who collected the money and disappeared. Dean's face had gone completely white. "How could you possibly know about..." "Because the FBI traced every dollar you stole, every identity you used, every boat you rented. Your offshore accounts contained money from all 3 insurance payouts. You and Angeline weren't just planning to kill me. You'd been perfecting your system for years." Those were different situations, Dean said frantically. Complex business arrangements that you couldn't understand. Stop. I leaned forward, my voice deadly quiet. Just stop lying. For once in your pathetic life, tell the truth. You murdered 3 innocent women for money. You were planning to murder me. The only difference is that I caught you. Dean stared at me for a long moment, and I could see him calculating, trying to find some angle, some way to regain control of the narrative. Finally, his shoulders sagged in defeat. "You're right," he whispered. "God help me. You're right about everything." "I know I am. The question is whether you're going to help us bring justice to those families, or whether you're going to keep lying until the day you die in prison." Dean looked up at me with something that might have been respect. "When did you become so ruthless?" "The day I realized my husband was planning to kill me." 6 months later, I sat in a federal courthouse, watching Dean Matthews receive 3 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole. The judge's words were sharp and uncompromising as she described his crimes. The defendant's calculated manipulation and murder of innocent women represents a level of depravity that demands the fullest extent of justice. Angeline Turner received the same sentence. Jensen Crawford, in exchange for his cooperation, got 25 years. Captain Williams, who had testified against all of them, received 10 years and would be eligible for parole in 5. But the real victory wasn't in the courtroom. It was in the letters I'd received from the families of Patricia Henley, Margaret Foster, and Diana Walsh. After years of believing their loved ones had died in tragic accidents, they finally had answers, finally had justice, finally could begin to heal. "I can't thank you enough," Patricia's daughter had written. "For 3 years, I blamed myself for not being there, for not somehow preventing Mom's accident. Now I know there was nothing I could have done. You gave me my mother's memory back." Those letters meant more to me than any legal victory ever could. Standing outside the courthouse that day, I felt the warm spring sunshine on my face and realized that I was exactly where I needed to be. Not the naive woman who had trusted blindly, but not the bitter victim of a con man either. I was someone who had faced the worst humanity had to offer and emerged stronger. My father joined me on the courthouse steps, both of us watching Dean's transport van disappear into traffic for the last time. "Any regrets?" he asked. I thought about it seriously. "Just one. I regret that it took me so long to see what you saw from the beginning." "You saw it when it mattered," he said. "That's what counts." The financial settlements had been substantial. The insurance companies, embarrassed by how easily their systems had been exploited, had paid out significant compensation beyond the original policy amounts. Dean's seized assets, the recovered offshore accounts, and the civil settlements meant I was more financially secure than I'd ever been. But money wasn't the real prize. The real prize was the woman I'd become. Someone who couldn't be manipulated, couldn't be fooled, couldn't be made a victim ever again. Someone who had learned that trust should be earned, not given freely, and that the most dangerous predators often wear the most charming masks. I kept the house in Westfield, but transformed it completely. Every room was redecorated. Every piece of furniture that held memories of Dean was donated or destroyed. It became my space, not ours, filled with things I chose because I loved them, not because they impressed anyone else. 6 months after the trial, Agent Chen called with the news I'd been hoping for. "We identified 2 more potential victims using your case as a template. Both women are safe, both perpetrators are in custody, and both operations have been shut down." "How many is that now?" 7 women whose lives were saved because you refused to be victim number 4. As I hung up the phone, I smiled. Dean had been right about one thing. His plan really had changed everything for us. Just not the way he'd intended. His perfect crime had become my perfect life. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.